So the vast majority of philosophical writing about and psychological research on selfhood and virtue tends to come from either a cognitive or developmental perspective, broadly construed. And these perspectives have generated a tremendous amount of important research, but they tend to encourage the classification of biologically or neurologically rooted types of personality, emotion, and virtue. By contrast, our project aims to understand people's phenomenological experience. In short, what is it like to feel a positive or negative sense of self? What is it like to feel the capacity for virtue or to be shut off from it? And as a result of this focus, our project highlights the significance of affective processes. For example, many philosophers and psychologists have proposed that virtue can only arise from a foundational sense of connectedness to other people. And we submit that this sense of connectedness has a deep affective core. In other words, emotions play not only a secondary or epiphenomenal role, but rather are constitutive of the experience of self and the capacity for virtue. And in particular, our project highlights a unique class of affective phenomena recently identified in philosophy as existential feelings. So our first specific aim for this project is to identify the role of existential feelings in virtue. And secondly, we will investigate changes in existential feeling as a function of aging in order to illuminate the part played by development in virtue. And we will accomplish these aims using a variety of innovative methods. Existential feelings are best understood as background states out of which more specific emotional or cognitive episodes arise. So at any given point in time, we have a particular way of being affectively oriented to the world, of finding ourselves in our environment, which partly influences our interpretation of ongoing events. And these affective orientations open us up to certain possibilities for experience, while simultaneously shutting us off from others. So to make this a little more concrete, consider the example of positively valenced existential feelings, which most of us take for granted on a day-to-day basis. So normally, as we move around through our various environments, we have a basic sense of being welcome in those environments, of comfortableness and ease with the people around us. And this is very different from those times where we may be suddenly thrust into an experience of negatively valenced existential feelings, of feeling rejected, isolated, or disconnected from other people and the surrounding environment. Now, the majority of research on existential feelings to date has focused on the phenomenology of individuals who suffer from various forms of psychopathology. And when trying to understand the experience of a person with major depression, for example, it's important to recognize that this person doesn't just experience a greater number of negative emotion states, rather they have a fundamentally different way of being affectively oriented to the world, involving a continuous sense of their environment as bleak and uninviting. Now, our project represents the first interdisciplinary attempt to illuminate the part played by existential feelings in the self-concepts of non-clinical individuals. In particular, we propose that existential feelings play a vital part in the self's capacity for virtue. And here we follow the thinking of theologian Paul Tillich, who argued that virtue has a deep affective basis. Tillich proposed that only those people who feel a fundamental sense of acceptance from the world and others around them will have the ability to possess certain virtues. And he highlighted three virtues which have also been identified in the psychological literature summarized by Peterson and Seligman. And based on these ideas, we propose that those individuals who are experiencing more positive existential feelings will have a heightened capacity for the virtues of courage, transcendence, which we understand as the ability to feel hope and awe, and humanity, so engaging in acts of kindness and generosity. So in empirically testing our first aim for the project, we will be guided by the general hypothesis that both in terms of dispositional and situational variation, the experience of positive existential feelings will increase the self's capacity for courage, humanity, and transcendence, whereas conversely, experiencing negative existential feelings will decrease the capacity for these virtues. Now, when it comes to the second aim of our project, understanding changes in existential feelings across the lifespan, the prior literature is a little mixed as to what we might expect. We've heard about some of this over the course of the talks here. So on the one hand, older adults often experience life events that could be associated with a rise in negative existential feeling. So we might imagine the case of an older, recently bereaved adult transitioning to a retirement community or some new living arrangement who might sense reduced agency and familiarity with their environment. On the other hand, many older adults seem to acquire certain emotional resources which could be facilitative of virtue. Many older adults, particularly those in more positive life circumstances who are still physically able, maybe come from higher socioeconomic status backgrounds or who have a sense of social connection to others, often speak of a sense of generativity and acceptance which should be associated with more positive existential feelings. There are many examples of this in the recent book Lighter as We Go by Greenstein and Holland on the psychology of aging. So when it comes to our second aim for the project, we will be guided by the general model that older individuals will have a heightened proclivity towards negative existential feelings, which in turn will be associated with a reduced capacity for courage, humanity, and transcendence specifically. However, we believe this general path may be moderated by other variables at different points. So for example, those older adults in more generally positive life circumstances who have a sense of social connectedness to others will not show the same elevated level of negative existential feeling. And furthermore, we believe the negative impact of age on virtue may be reduced or reversed through a temporary induction of positive existential feeling. Now, this is a chart providing an overview of the studies that we have planned. I believe you have a handout if you have difficulty reading any of this information. As you might imagine, based on my description thus far, the study of existential feelings presents unique methodological challenges. And when we meet these challenges using a variety of methods and populations, in studies 1 and 2, we will use qualitative and quantitative surveys to develop unique concepts and measures for the assessment of existential feelings and their relationship to virtue. In study 3, we will use a novel film induction experimental method to assess the causal impact of existential feelings on virtue. And in studies 4 and 5, we will turn to a consideration of the relationship between dispositional and situational variation in existential feelings to virtue among older adults. So studies 1, 2, and 4 represent our commitment to deep integration by offering an ongoing dialogue between qualitative and quantitative sources of data. My colleague Achim and also Matthew Ratcliffe have experience deriving philosophical analyses from qualitative data. So in our phenomenological surveys, we will ask our participants questions about their experiences of emotion. For example, we will ask our older adult participants questions about how their recent emotion experience might differ from when they were younger. We will also ask participants open-ended questions about the meanings of virtue and specifically courage, humanity, and transcendence for them. And these qualitative results will be used in concert with quantitative measures. For example, I have some pilot data attesting to the validity of a measure of individual differences in existential feeling with items such as this one intended to capture a sense of negative existential feeling. Now, beyond participants' self-reported experiences, we will also be using experiments to assess the causal impact of existential feelings on virtue. For example, in study 3, university students will be randomly assigned to view a film clip designed either to induce a positive or negative existential feeling. Since no inductions of existential feeling yet exist, we'll be embarking on an exciting collaboration with the U of A School of Theater, Film, and Television to produce and design these clips. So students in the school, as part of a class project, will create short films designed to specifically invoke positive or negative existential feelings in the viewer. They will be aided by our film scholar, Osbjørn Gronstad, who will act as a consultant in this process. We will show one of these two clips to our student participants before assessing their willingness to engage in virtuous behavior, such as participating in campus charity activities. And in line with our general hypothesis, we expect that those who view a clip invoking positive existential feelings will be more willing to engage in virtuous behavior. Our other experiment also uses a unique method. Autophotography is a rich method that was developed by personality psychologist Rob Ziller, through which participants use a camera to generate several images that they believe represent who they are. And these images can be coded for the salience of certain themes. For example, studies suggest that some participants produce images conveying themes of interpersonal connectedness. There are several other people in the pictures, whereas others offer images that are lower in social content. As you might imagine, this is an ideal method for capturing an abstract concept like existential feelings. So in study 5, we will ask members of a retirement community who score high in dispositional positive or negative existential feelings to produce images of their community. We will then randomly assign incoming members of the community to view one of these two sets of images before assessing their willingness to engage in virtuous behaviors, such as participating in community-organized volunteer events. And we expect that those participants viewing images of the community produced by community members who score high in positive existential feeling, these individuals will feel more engaged and welcome in the community and will be more willing to participate in virtuous activities. We have some pilot data attesting to the validity of this method. We had university students produce images conveying who they think they are. These are images which come from a student who scores relatively high in our preliminary measure of positive existential feelings. And such students tend to produce images of the environments with which they identify, such as the university library or a church, and also which convey themes of social connectedness. By contrast, this is an image from a participant who scores higher in our measure of negative existential feelings. These images tend to convey more of a sense of isolation, self-focus, as came up in the last presentation. So for example, this participant is alone against a blurry background, almost perhaps implying a kind of disconnect between the self and the surrounding environment. Throughout these studies, we will use multiple measures to triangulate on the virtues of courage, humanity, and transcendence, previously validated quantitative measures, behaviors in our experimental studies, but we also hope to develop novel conceptualizations of these virtues, for example, through our phenomenological surveys. Of course, there are challenges for a project such as this, such as the integration of qualitative and quantitative data, but we believe this challenge can be met by truly listening to the dialogue between these sources of information. Our qualitative surveys may yield results that will be surprising to us and which can inform and revise our quantitative instruments. At the same time, the qualitative data can be coded in order to assess the level of correlation between the qualitative results and the quantitative results. In general, we think that a multi-method approach is challenging but vital for the study of a unique construct like existential feelings. There's also the question of whether our temporary inductions of existential feeling can truly impact virtue, but here we take some inspiration from the vast social psychological literature testifying to the surprising power of minor situational forces. Philosophers like Nancy have recently written about the importance of these kinds of forces for virtue. And furthermore, we assert that if we do see an impact of our temporary inductions, we can certainly expect something more profound for for dispositional tendencies towards positive or negative existential feeling. So in sum, we propose that our project stands to make theoretical and practical impact. It should deepen our understanding of the role of affective processes in the experience of the self and the capacity for virtue. At the same time, we hope to illuminate changes in virtue across the lifespan as a function of changes in affective experience. And our ultimate hope is that these more theoretical contributions can actually generate a practical contribution in enhancing the lives of older adults. For example, information from the photographs and the surveys that we collect from our participants may help us to come up with ways to structurally change the environments, such as the retirement communities in which some older adults spend their last years, in order to improve their general emotional experience and hence capacity for virtue. Thank you very much for having us here, and we're very happy to take questions.
if I heard you correctly, you seem to be defining existential feeling somewhat globally. That is, so, at a given moment, someone has either positive or negative existential feeling. But I'm interested in thinking about potentially different levels. So there might be a level at which one has positive NEF and one at which one has negative. And some of the most remarkable, virtuous exemplars we can think of are people who were not well connected, accepted at home, say, in some social level. Maybe they had some other source for positive existential feeling. But could you comment on that at all?
Could I perhaps? There are a lot of blendings possible for existential feelings. So just to give you a short idea, some of those which we normally don't pay attention towards are feeling real, yourself, others, and the world you are in. These are the ones that might be disturbed in psychopathology. But then you might, for example, go to bed and have the idea of what you write the next day. Then you wake up with the flu and feel weak. And there's no energy, there's no control of the events, so to say. But at the same moment, your family might care for you. So your daughters bring you tea, somebody else cares for you. So you have a feeling of connectedness which is high and which is, well, a very positive existential feeling, whereas the other, the more self-related, is a sort of weakness. So you can have a lot of these blendings. The more dispositional and interesting ones are those that we want to get an idea of what is typical for a certain lifespan. So say for puberty, what sort of connectedness would someone in retrospect give us about how life was for she or her or him during the period from 13 to 17, and what changes when you are an adult and have full responsibility for family, for job. What are then the feelings, and what might happen when you are older than 75 and you lose friends, you have maybe technology has advantages where you can't connect, you are not able to have the newest things to connect with others worldwide, and so on, where a lot of these issues might come in a very late age. And so that would be one of the focus, to see what are typical existential feelings in lifespans. And then others are more variable within these periods, like this weakness of a flu or so. Gives that enough?
Yeah, no, that's helpful. Are you going to be looking at social location at all, race, class?
Yeah, so one thing that I didn't really mention, but both in our qualitative and quantitative surveys, we plan to include several other kinds of measures. So for example, for me as a psychologist, there are several demographic and personality measures that we can get to try and assess the impact of those sorts of issues. Because I think they're very important. And particularly as we mentioned, the moderation of the relationship between age and existential feeling, I think that whether you come from a high SES background will make a huge difference.
Will, and then Howard, then Nancy.
Hi. I'm trying to get a handle on this concept of existential feelings, a little bit of understanding of what it is. Did you have a slide real early where you gave some example terms that were part of existential feelings? Did I see that, or did I make that up?
Well,
Yeah,
these are descriptions,
the next
and
slide.
these are examples of perhaps what these positive and negative ones look like.
Right. So at times it feels like you're talking about negative and positive affect, and particularly when you talk about the research on how negative and positive existential feelings change over the lifespan, and you cited Roberts and so on. And then other times it feels like you're really assessing sort of a neat feeling of belongingness or connectedness. And I guess the top one represents that. The negative one's sort of a mix of negative affect and connectedness. So I'm curious about how does it stand compared to other emotions, and what is the word existential doing there? Why are they called existential? What does that add to the concept of it? Thanks.
Yeah, I think maybe you should go first, and then I'll provide a psychological.
Yeah, there are two things that we should try to have apart from each other. One is the notion of existential feeling, which can be developed in far more detailedness and richness, and what you can operationalize for a study. So these here have to be seen more like what you could try to induce in a study. I think it will be pretty hard to induce, say, a sort of connectedness without some other aspects of feeling. So therefore, we have here more a positive blending and a negative blending, which could be tried to get induced and then differentiated from just positive emotions, where you could try to see whether the outcomes of such a study are the same as if you just induce happiness or something. Yeah? Now on the side of the existential feelings, it was something that Matthew Radcliffe, another member of our group, discussed in his Feelings of Being in 2008, and where I tried to get a more detailed grip on that. And so I thought from psychopathologies you could find that this deepest thing that could be disturbed is a feeling of reality. And you see then in, say, Capgras distortions, there is a loss of reality of the others, whereas in Cotard, of yourself. In depersonalization, there's also a loss of feeling of yourself. Now in deep and major depression, there is a loss of connectedness. So people describe metaphors as being under a bell jar, or as if the world is packed into clouds, and there's no real grip. And that's different from a mood. So the best expression for that is, I think, really, that's a sort of existential feeling, how you relate to the world in these ways. And then there are others that are more common, which we experience each day. So some are more of an atmospheric type that are really event-related. So you go for a job interview, enter the room, and you feel an icy atmosphere maybe. And you think you better had stayed at home for that day. Or it's very welcoming, and you find your place and you give a nice talk, and it's a completely different way of how you relate. And then there are some dispositions, wherever you go, you feel somehow disconnected. Then that's different from this more event-driven thing, which could be completely different when you go to another meeting. And some are more internalized due to your upbringing, due to your experiences before that go with you for a certain time.
It sounds very static, though, like you come and then the icy feeling or the welcoming, rather than an interaction between how you behave and they behave, and you break the ice.
But it's a first impression, right?
Yeah.
So you have it also with buildings, with environments. You might walk through a very busy town and find a silent place than in an old chapel or in a mosque, and calm down and feel this atmosphere there. And of course, it's a mutual influence. But sometimes I guess you also have that experience. You come into a room and there is some atmosphere, and that structures already your behaviors. You are not free from that. You have some impact, but you can't change it completely.
And I just want to quickly add, hopefully we can get one more question, but for the psychologists, in study 3, one advantage of working with the film crews is that we'll be able to produce generally similar films conveying more specific emotion states like anger, happiness, fear, and so on. And so we'll try to contrast the effect of these existential feelings with more standard emotion states and see what kinds of differences we get.
Howard, 1 minute.
I actually wanted to ask about this particular slide as well, as moving on from Will's question a little bit. So here you're talking about exactly a contrast that lines up with the UCLA loneliness scale. So I'm interested to understand, given that there's a pretty broad and deep program of research about loneliness that has looked at the induction of loneliness or induction of social connectedness and the notion of the lifespan differentiation of it, its effect as mood on perception of events, et cetera, et cetera. How will you operationally distinguish aspects of this from loneliness?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So one way of answering is that you could frame part of what we're doing and what we'll be able to do with our surveys as maybe establishing more of a process, so starting to bring in this affective component, and not just any affective component, but a more phenomenologically rich understanding of affect to understanding the links between things like loneliness, more standard kinds of personality or dispositional variables. Another more empirical way of answering it is in some of the pilot data I've gotten with items like this, asking people, do you feel at home in the world, and things like that. That relates, as you might expect, with all kinds of established variables, so things like loneliness, things like neuroticism, and so on, anxiety. But there are interesting effects that these items have on outcomes like anxiety, which hold controlling for all these other sorts of things. So, neuroticism, loneliness, they contribute to anxiety, but there's some kind of unique connection, so far in my data anyway, between this sort of sense of disconnect and some of those outcomes. So I don't want to say that this is everything, and because in many ways this is just another way of looking at those kinds of experiences, but I think it contributes something.
Are you using the dissociative experiences scale? Because that would seem to...
Not actually in this particular study, but one of the other team members, Roman, is a clinical psychologist who actually does a lot of work with dissociation. So yeah, that's a great idea.
All right, thank you very much.